After you walked away, something shifted, and it wasn't what you think. They didn't suddenly become better for someone else. They didn't magically transform into the person you were hoping for. No, they became more of who they truly are. And now, the very patterns you endured are unfolding again. Only this time, you're not the one carrying the weight. The new supply is stepping into a storm they didn't see coming, and you're finally standing outside of it. One of the most important truths you must come to terms with is this. When you left, the narcissist did not suddenly become a better person. They simply lost access to you. And losing access is not the same as gaining awareness. You see, growth requires reflection. It requires a person to pause, to evaluate their actions, to take responsibility for the damage they've caused, and to make intentional changes from the inside out. But a narcissistic mindset resists this entire process. Why? Because accountability feels like an attack on their identity. To admit wrongdoing would mean confronting a version of themselves they have spent a lifetime trying to avoid. So instead of transforming, they redirect. When you walked away, you removed something critical from their life, not love, because what they often call love is rooted in control, but supply. You removed the attention, the emotional energy, the validation, and even the stability that you unknowingly provided. And without that supply, they are left to face something they are deeply uncomfortable with themselves. But rather than sit in that discomfort and grow, they look for the fastest escape route. This is why it can appear on the outside that they moved on quickly or even improved. They may present themselves as happier, more attentive, more engaged with someone new, but understand this clearly. This is not evidence of change. It is evidence of substitution. The core has not been addressed. A person who refuses to examine their patterns will inevitably repeat them. It may look different in the beginning. There may be more charm, more effort, more calculated behavior, but that is not transformation. It is performance. And performance cannot be sustained without internal alignment. Over time, the same traits begin to resurface. The need for control, the emotional manipulation, the inability to take responsibility, the subtle erosion of the other person's confidence. These patterns are not random. They are rooted in an unresolved internal framework that does not change simply because the environment changes. And this is where many people struggle. They begin to question themselves. They wonder, why couldn't they be this way with me? Or did I miss something? Was I the problem? But that line of thinking is built on a false assumption that the narcissist became better after you left. They didn't. What actually happened is that you disrupted their system. You stepped out of a role that was feeding their dysfunction. You stopped participating in a cycle that required your presence to continue. And in doing so, you created a void. Now here is the key. A void forces exposure. Without you there to absorb, to adjust, to tolerate, the cracks in their behavior become more visible. But instead of repairing those cracks, they cover them with something new. Another person, another distraction, another source of supply. This is why the pattern continues. Because the issue was never the relationship itself. It was the internal condition of the person within it. And until that condition is addressed, nothing externally will produce lasting change. So when you look back, do not measure your worth by their next relationship. Do not interpret their quick replacement as evidence that you are not enough. In reality, it is the opposite. You were enough to sustain something that was never healthy to begin with. You were enough to keep a system functioning that should have collapsed much earlier. And when you left, that system lost its balance. That is not your failure. That is your clarity. Because it takes strength to walk away from something that still has emotional ties. It takes awareness to recognize that staying would only continue the cycle. And it takes courage to accept that someone may never become who you hope they would be. So, understand this deeply. Their lack of change is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of their avoidance. And avoidance always comes at a cost. The cost is growth. The cost is healthy connection. The cost is repeating the same dysfunction in different forms with different people over and over again. But you are no longer part of that cycle. You stepped out. You broke the pattern. And in doing so, you gave yourself something they may never choose, true transformation. When you walked away, what you removed from the narcissist's life was not just your presence. You removed their primary source of emotional regulation. That is something many people don't fully understand. A narcissist does not function from a place of internal stability. They rely heavily on external external sources, people, attention, validation, to maintain a sense of control over their identity and emotions. So when you left, you didn't just create distance. You disrupted the entire system they were depending on to feel okay. Your absence didn't bring them peace, it brought exposure. Because without someone constantly affirming them, adjusting to them, or absorbing their emotional fluctuations, they are forced to face something they have spent most of their life avoiding, their own instability. And instead of processing that instability in a healthy way, they react to it. That reaction often shows up as urgency, a need to quickly replace what was lost. Not because they have healed, not because they have reflected, but because the silence you left behind becomes unbearable. Silence for a narcissistic mind is not peaceful, it is confronting. It forces them to sit with thoughts they don't want to examine and emotions they don't know how to regulate. So they rush to find someone else. But here is where the deeper truth lies. The new person is not stepping into a healed environment. They are stepping into an emotional vacuum, a space that is demanding to be filled, not nurtured. And that pressure changes everything. Because when someone enters a relationship with a narcissist who has not healed, they are not meeting a stable individual. They are meeting someone who is operating from lack, from urgency, from emotional dependency. That means the expectations are higher, the control is tighter, and the tolerance for anything that threatens their ego is even lower than before. Your absence intensifies their behavior. Why? Because you were in many ways buffering the extremes. Even if you didn't realize it, you were managing reactions, avoiding triggers, adjusting your behavior to keep peace. That created a temporary sense of balance. But once you are gone, that balance disappears. Now there is no one to absorb the tension, no one to soften the outbursts, no one who understands the patterns well enough to navigate them. And as a result, what the new person experiences is often a more unfiltered version of the narcissist behavior. The charm may still be there in the beginning, but it is layered over deeper instability. The emotional highs and lows can become more intense, the need for control more obvious, and the reactions more unpredictable. This is why it is important for you to stop questioning whether they are better with someone else. They are not better, they are just redirected. The same unresolved issues, the same emotional patterns, the same need for control and validation. None of that disappears simply because the person beside them has changed. Those patterns are internal, and until they are addressed, they follow the narcissist into every new connection. What changes is not the narcissist's behavior at its core, but the environment in which it is expressed. And in this case, that environment is now dealing with the aftershock of your absence. So while it may look like they moved on easily, what actually happened is that they replaced stability with urgency. They replaced familiarity with control. They replaced a regulated dynamic, however imperfect, with one that is more reactive and less balanced. And that is not something to envy. That is something to understand. Because understanding this frees you from comparison. It frees you from the illusion that you lost something valuable that someone else is now benefiting from. What you walked away from did not become better. It became more exposed. And exposure without healing always leads to escalation. What you must come to understand deeply and without illusion is that the new person in their life did not receive an upgraded version of the narcissist. They inherited everything that was unresolved, unhealed, and unacknowledged long before you ever walked away. Human behavior does not reset simply because the environment changes. A new face does not create a new character. It only provides a new stage for the same internal patterns to perform. And when a person refuses to confront their own dysfunction, they carry it forward, not leave it behind. So while it may appear on the surface that they have moved on and become better, what has actually happened is far more predictable. They have repeated the cycle, but now with less restraint and more urgency. Because every time a narcissist loses someone who once stabilized them, they become more desperate to secure control again. Not love, control. The new supply often walks in believing they have found something special. They are met with intensity, attention, and what feels like deep connection. But that is not authenticity. It is strategy. It is the same pattern that once pulled you in. And because it feels real in the beginning, beginning, they invest quickly, emotionally attaching themselves before they have the awareness to question what they are experiencing. But here is where the truth begins to unfold. The narcissist has not healed from the past. They have not reflected, corrected, or taken responsibility, which means the same insecurities, the same emotional volatility, the same need for dominance is still present. Only now it is buried beneath a temporary performance. And performances do not last. Over time, the mask begins to slip. The patience fades, the charm weakens, and what was once subtle becomes more obvious. Control turns into pressure. Attention turns into inconsistency. Affection turns into manipulation. The new supply starts to feel the confusion you once felt. They begin to question themselves the way you once did. They start trying to fix things, adjust themselves, and make sense of behavior that was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be endured. Because the truth is, they are not dealing with a new person. They are dealing with a continuation of the same unresolved identity. And in many cases, it becomes even more intense than before. Why? Because each failed relationship leaves the narcissist more fractured internally. Their tolerance for vulnerability decreases. Their fear of abandonment increases. And instead of addressing those issues, they compensate by becoming more controlling, more reactive, and more emotionally unpredictable. So the new supply is not experiencing a better version. They are experiencing a more unstable one. And this is why you must release any lingering thought that they change for someone else. Change requires accountability. Growth requires self-awareness. And without those elements, repetition is inevitable. You were not replaced by someone better. You were replaced by someone new. And new does not mean safe. It simply means unaware. Unaware of the patterns, unaware of the cycles, unaware of the cost. But awareness always comes eventually. And when it does, they will begin to see what you saw. They will begin to feel what you felt. And they will begin to understand what you finally had the strength to walk away from. So instead of looking at this situation with comparison, look at it with clarity. You escaped a cycle that is still repeating. You stepped out of something that is still unfolding. You chose growth over confusion, peace over performance, and truth over illusion. And that is something the narcissist cannot replicate, no matter who they bring into their life next. When a narcissistic personality avoids accountability, something very predictable begins to happen beneath the surface. Behavior doesn't stabilize, it intensifies. This is because accountability is the only mechanism that interrupts destructive patterns. Without it, there is no internal correction, no reflection, no recalibration of actions. Instead, there is justification, denial, blame shifting, and emotional deflection. Over time, this creates a dangerous cycle where the individual becomes more entrenched in their behavior, not less. You must understand that ego, when left unchecked, does not remain at the same level. It expands. It demands more validation, more control, and more dominance to sustain itself. So when a narcissist experiences a significant disruption, like your departure, their ego interprets it not as a moment for self-examination, but as an injury that must be compensated for. And because they are unwilling to look inward, they look outward for something or someone to restore their sense of superiority and control. This is where escalation begins. Instead of asking, what did I do wrong? They ask, how do I regain control? Instead of reflecting on their behavior, they rewrite the narrative to protect their image. In their mind, they are not the cause of the breakdown. You are. The relationship did not fail because of their dysfunction. It failed because you were too sensitive, too demanding. On honey, hasis, kiwap cha, tu, kuam, or ti, not enough. And he, the tats, the di, the dachi, dei. This distorted interpretation allows them to preserve their ego while avoiding the discomfort of truth. But avoiding truth comes at a cost, because when there is no accountability, there is no learning. And when there is no learning, the same patterns repeat, but with greater intensity. The manipulation becomes more calculated. The emotional reactions become more volatile. The need for control becomes more aggressive. Why? Amaskus Because internally, they are operating from a place of instability that is growing, not shrinking. Your absence amplifies this. While you were present, there may have been moments where your awareness, your resistance, or even your attempts to communicate created a form of pressure that limited how far their behavior could go. Not because they changed, but because there was friction. There was someone pushing back, questioning, or setting boundaries, even if imperfectly. Now that friction is gone. And without resistance, unchecked behavior accelerates. The new person who enters their life is not stepping into a healed environment. They are stepping into an environment where the dysfunction has had time to deepen. The narcissist is now more desperate to secure control, more sensitive to perceived rejection, and more committed to maintaining the illusion of perfection. This means the cycle doesn't restart at zero. It resumes at a more advanced and more intense stage. And here is where many people misunderstand what they see. From the outside, it may look like everything is better. The narcissist may appear more attentive, more charming, even more invested. But what you are witnessing is not growth. It is strategy. It is the early phase of the same cycle, intensified by the need to prove something to themselves, to others, and even indirectly to you. But strategy cannot replace transformation. Eventually, the same triggers will emerge. The same insecurities will surface. The same inability to handle criticism, rejection, or emotional vulnerability will reveal itself. And because the internal issues were never addressed, the reactions will be stronger, sharper, and more damaging. This is the reality of escalation. It is not random. It is not situational. It is the natural consequence of a person refusing to confront themselves while continuing to demand control over others. So, if you ever find yourself wondering whether they changed, whether they became better for someone else, you must return to this principle. People do not outgrow patterns they refuse to acknowledge. Witzig. And what you escaped was not just the behavior you saw. It was the version of that behavior that had not yet reached its full intensity. That is why your decision to walk away was not just an act of self-preservation. It was an act of wisdom. Because staying longer would not have led to resolution. It would have led to deeper entanglement in a cycle that was only becoming more difficult to survive. Now, you are no longer inside that cycle. You are observing it from a distance, with clarity you didn't have before. And that clarity is your advantage. It allows you to see what is truly happening, not just what is being presented. And once you see it clearly, you stop questioning your exit. You start understanding that what escalates without accountability will eventually collapse under its own weight, but you will not be there when it does. What often appears on the surface can be deeply misleading, and if you are not grounded in understanding, you may start to question your own decision. You might look at their new relationship and think they finally changed, that they've somehow become the person you needed them to be. But what you're seeing is not transformation, it is repetition dressed in new packaging. The cycle has not been broken. It has simply restarted with a different face, a different name, and a different beginning. In the early stages, everything always looks convincing. There is charm, attention, intensity, and what feels like genuine connection. But this is not new behavior. It is a familiar pattern. It is the same strategy that once drew you in. The difference now is not in them, but in your awareness. You have already seen behind the curtain. You know how the story unfolds once the excitement fades and reality begins to demand consistency, accountability, and emotional depth. A person who refuses to confront themselves cannot create something new. They can only recreate what they already are. And when someone operates from unresolved insecurity, unchecked ego, and a constant need for control, those traits do not disappear simply because a new person has entered their life. In fact, those traits often intensify. Why? Because the internal pressure continues to build, and without true growth, there is no release, only projection. So what happens is this: the same patterns begin to emerge, sometimes even faster and more aggressively. The emotional highs and lows, the subtle manipulation, the shifting of blame, the need to dominate the narrative, all of it resurfaces. And the new person, just like you once did, may try to rationalize it. They may believe they can love this person into becoming better. They may think patience will lead to change, change, but patience cannot fix what denial refuses to acknowledge. It is important for you to understand that cycles do not break themselves. They require interruption. They require awareness. They require a decision to do something different, even when it is uncomfortable. And when that decision is not made, the cycle becomes a loop, repeating, reinforcing, and deepening over time. Each new relationship does not heal the dysfunction. It gives it another place to operate. That is why you must not compare your ending to their new beginning. You are looking at two completely different points in the same cycle. You experience what happens when the mask begins to slip, when the effort becomes inconsistent, and when the truth can no longer be hidden. What they are experiencing now is the introduction phase, where everything is carefully presented and strategically controlled. But time reveals what performance tries to hide. And eventually, reality demands more than appearance. It demands substance. It demands emotional responsibility. It demands growth. And when those things are not present, the same breakdown occurs because the foundation was never solid to begin with. You must also recognize the strength it took for you to walk away. Leaving was not just about ending a relationship. It was about disrupting a pattern. It was about choosing clarity over confusion, truth over illusion, and self-respect over emotional survival. That is not something to second guess. That is something to honor. While they continue moving in circles, you have stepped out of the loop. You are no longer participating in something that drains you, diminishes you, and keeps you stuck in emotional instability. You have created space for something different, something real, something healthy, something aligned with growth, and that is the difference. They are repeating. You are evolving. So when you feel tempted to look back, remind yourself of this. Nothing has changed unless the person has changed. And change is not proven by a new partner. It is proven by new behavior, new thinking, and a consistent willingness to take responsibility. Without that, every new beginning is simply a delayed ending waiting to happen. You need to understand something that will completely shift how you see your past, your pain, and even your decision to walk away. When you left, it may have felt like loss. It may have felt like you were giving up on something that could have worked, something that had potential, something that you invested your heart into. But what you didn't realize in that moment is that your departure was not the end of something valuable. It was the interruption of something deceptive. Because what you were part of was not a stable, growing, mutually fulfilling connection. It was an illusion sustained by your effort, your patience, your understanding, and your willingness to tolerate what should never have been normalized. You were compensating for what they lacked. You were carrying emotional weight that was never yours to carry. And over time, without even noticing it, you became the glue holding together something that was constantly breaking underneath the surface. So when you walked away, you didn't just leave a person, you disrupted a system where they relied on you to regulate their emotions, to absorb their inconsistency, to make sense of their confusion, and to clean up the damage they created. And once that system was removed, the truth had no choice but to reveal itself. This is why it may look like they moved on quickly. This is why it may seem like they replaced you without hesitation. But what you must see clearly is this. Replacement is not healing. Moving on is not the same as growing. And finding someone new does not mean they became someone better. In fact, what often happens is the exact opposite. Without you there to stabilize the chaos, their behavior intensifies. The cracks you were covering begin to widen. The patterns you are managing begin to spiral. And the new person, unaware of the depth of what they've stepped into, becomes the next one to experience the same cycle, often at a more accelerated and more painful level. And here is where your perspective must change. You are not the one who lost. You are the one who stepped out of a cycle that was designed to drain you, confuse you, and keep you stuck in a loop of trying to fix what was never yours to fix. You didn't walk away from love. You walked away from dysfunction disguised as love. What makes this powerful is that your departure created space. Space for clarity, space for healing, space for you to reconnect with yourself without the constant noise of instability and emotional unpredictability. And in that space, something begins to happen. You start to see things as they truly were, not as you hoped they would be. You begin to recognize the patterns you once excused. You begin to understand the ways you were overextending yourself. You begin to reclaim parts of your identity that were slowly being eroded. And most importantly, you begin to realize that your value was never dependent on their ability to recognize it. While they continue repeating cycles, you now have the opportunity to break them. While they seek validation externally, you can build confidence internally. While they perform for appearances, you can develop authenticity. And that is the difference, because growth is not loud. Growth is not performative. Growth does not rush to prove anything to anyone. Growth is quiet, steady, and rooted in truth. And once you step into that, you no longer feel the need to look back and question your decision. Instead, you begin to feel gratitude, not for what happened, but for what you escaped. Because staying would have cost you more than leaving ever did. So don't measure your progress by what they are doing now. Don't compare your healing to their distractions. Understand that you are on a different path entirely, one that leads to wholeness, clarity, and peace. And once you reach that place, you will see it clearly. Walking away was not your loss. It was your breakthrough.